Development of the University of Louisville. She is a participatory action researcher who conducts work in both school and community settings. Her most recent research focuses on research ethics in educational and community settings and on the transformation of institutions of higher education through action research. She is the editor, together with David Coughlin, of the SAGE Encyclopedia of Action Research, and has recently completed a book on ethical challenges in the context of participatory action research with Professor Sarah Banks from Durham University. One of her current global action research projects focuses on working with middle school teachers and their students to engage the students as citizen scientists to better understand the impacts of climate change, where De La Salle University and De La Salle Sobel represent the Philippines as a participating country together with USA, Ireland, Peru, Norway, Sweden, South Africa, and Israel. A very dear friend, mentor, and research collaborator who considers Philippines as her home away from home. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow action researchers, join me in welcoming the guru of action research, Professor Mary Brydon Miller.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brydon. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see you all. I can't tell you how heartbroken I was when the COVID virus hit and we weren't able to have our ARROW conference, because I look forward to being there and being with you all every year. And I was just devastated. So this is a little bit of making up for that, at least in the interim. So what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with everybody, if that's okay. Let's see here now. There we go. Can everybody see it okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. Good. So what we're going to be talking about today is what I'm calling the methodology candy store. And you all have been to a candy store before, and you walk in and there's just so many choices and so many things that you'd like to have. This is actually a picture of a candy store near where I live. And when you think about action research, I think oftentimes we think that there are very few ways of conducting action research. But in fact, when David Coughlin, who Dr. Prudente mentioned, and I edited the Encyclopedia of Action Research, we included over 100 different methods and methodologies as ways to do action research. So there are many, many, many ways to do this. And what I want to do today is just give you a taste of a few and encourage you to seek out other ideas that fit with the kind of work that you're doing. So what we're going to talk about today is basically start with an overview of the action research process. I'm not sure, how much background all of you have had, so just to sort of get us all on the same page. Then we're going to talk about some selected action research methods and maybe have you try a couple of them out as much as we can do under the current circumstances. Then talk a little bit about criteria for selecting a best method and quality criteria for publishing your action research if you're interested in doing that. And then if we have time at the end, some examples of action research studies, and maybe we can figure out a way with Dr. Dita to see if you have any questions. So the basic action research process is often talked about as a cyclical process or an iterative process. Hopefully we're not just going around in circles, but we're actually moving up in some way and advancing. So this is, I think, a nice way of depicting that. You start with reflecting on some kind of a problem, planning some action you want to take, taking that action, observing the results, and then going into the next cycle. One of the most important parts about action research, the key to action research in my mind, is developing close relationships with your research partners, whether that's teachers or community partners, whatever the context you're working in. So, but sometimes we talk about entering the community and we don't think of that in a very nuanced or thoughtful way. And I think it's important to think about, well, what kind of community am I entering? Am I entering a community that's already established, where people know each other and have identified a common problem? Is it a community where people are beginning to think about this, but maybe part of your work is helping them to organize and think together about a problem? Maybe it's just, this seems like an issue and we need to really start getting people together. It may be a very hierarchical community in which there are issues of power that have to be negotiated, a divided community in which people are at odds with one another and your job is initially just to bring everyone to the table and do some mediation, and a transient or an evolving community where maybe people sort of come and go from that community. If there are people who are homeless, for instance, where they may not be able to be with you all the time, how do you negotiate that? So first thing is to develop relationships and really think about the nature of the community that you're going to be in and get to know that community well. One of the things that I've discovered over the years of doing action research is that we play many different roles as action researchers. In a traditional research context, you go in, you come up with research questions, you gather data, you analyze data, you publish your data, and you move on. But in action research, you do all of those things, plus all of these other things. My friend Alfredo Ortiz, who's been working with me recently, and I have been looking at the roles and realms of action researchers. And what you see sort of on the edges of this slide are a lot of different roles that we play. We're sometimes political negotiators, we're sometimes advocates, we're sometimes practitioners, we're sometimes making coffee, moving furniture, providing food. Those are probably the key things to doing effective action research: move the furniture and provide food. But you can kind of put those all out into different realms of action research. So we've got realms of advocacy. That's one of our important tasks as action researchers, to advocate for positive change. It's not enough to identify a problem and point the way. We need to be active in making the change. We need to be relators. That gets back to the relationships. We need to be helping people to make sense of what's going on in a context. And we need to be emergent designers. We need to be thinking about sort of the shape of change that we want to envision with people and helping to bring that about. One of the things that is, as Dr. Prudente mentioned, really central to me is the idea of ethics and ethics for action research. So one way to think about that is to think about ethics as being focused, again, on relationships. It's a study of ethical relationships we have as human beings and with sentient creatures in the physical world. We include that because, as Dr. Prudente said, my work now focuses on climate change. So we're not simply interested in other persons, but the world in general. And then looking at the value, how we value those relationships in what we do, the actions that we take is, I think, important. Because again, this isn't sort of a theoretical thing. This is something that we do in practice every day. One way to think about the ethics of action research is to think about the Covenantal Model of action research. And this is something I learned from my friend Anna Inge Hilsen, who is an action researcher from Norway. And she talks about that as the unconditional responsibility and ethical demand to act in the best interests of our fellow human beings. And one of the things that I like about Anna Inge's definition there is the idea that this is unconditional. It's not like you have a choice in doing the right thing or not. You are required to be there, to be doing, to make positive change. And I think that that's a really nice way to think about what motivates us all as action researchers. So how do you go about translating that set of ethics into action, into your research practice? First thing is to center yourself within a set of values, to really think about what ethical principles, values motivate you as an action researcher. Second thing is get to know your community setting and participants. Again, you can see that this comes back to relationships over and over again. Identify aspects and levels of power among stakeholders. Think about the relationships among the stakeholders. Anticipate ethical issues to happen and be prepared to be surprised. I think, oftentimes when we get caught up in ethical dilemmas, it's because we haven't anticipated that something is going to happen. So if we're prepared and if we've thought about our values, I think we're more able to respond in a way that we're going to feel good about after the fact when something happens that we didn't see coming. So one of the things that drew me to action research is the idea that you can make a change. You can actually do something about it. You're not just writing about it. You're not just suggesting it. You're not telling somebody else what to do. You're involved as a change agent yourself. Elvis knew this. So one of the things to think about is what kind of level of change do you want to participate in? Are you thinking about change at the individual level? Hopefully that will happen, right? You will change as a person. Your understanding of the context will change. You'll deepen your own knowledge. The participants in your project, the students in your classrooms, the teachers with whom you work, your community partners will change and will grow and will learn. But you'll also have change at the group level. People will come together. They'll develop relationships among themselves. You'll develop relationships with them. And all the way up to organizational change, change at the regional or policy level. I know Dr. Prudente and I have been involved in some projects in other parts of the Philippines, looking at trying to deal with environmental damage in some of the beach areas and people coming together there and trying to change policy by working across sectors in the communities. All the way up to the possibility of creating change in legal systems. I have a close friend who does work on domestic violence using an action research model, and she's been working with judges across the state of Ohio here in the United States to think about change and how to get the legal system more sensitive to the needs of victims of domestic violence, all the way up to international change, which is the climate change project that we're working on now as an example of bringing people together across different countries to try to create change in the area of climate change education. So what does it take? And I'm assuming, Dr. Dita, that we're going to be able to make these slides available to people so that you don't have to write all of this down. And I realize it's a kind of a busy slide, but I wanted to sort of give everyone a sense of what it takes to make research that matters. Hang on just a second. Shirley, is there a way to get the thing that says "see waiting room" out of our way? Because it's right in the middle of where I'm looking at my own slide.
Okay, Mary, because I made you a co-host, that's why you get that note. Okay, I will disable now the co-hosting. Okay, sorry about that.
It's okay, thank you very much. This helps to be able to read my own slide. So, making research that matters. It needs to address a genuine problem of practice. You want to provide opportunities for people in your community or your schools, your organizations, who are most often not heard, to be able to participate in research. You want to recognize and build upon community strengths and assets. I think oftentimes we go into communities or schools looking at what's wrong, but we need to be focusing on what's right and what people have that they can bring to the table. We want to encourage more democratic ways of generating knowledge so that people feel that they have an investment in it and that their voices are being heard. We want to provide opportunities for the development of new skills and new ways of understanding the world, to provide opportunities for creativity and exploration. One of the things you'll note when we talk about some of these methods is that many of them draw upon the arts, and I think that's a way of tapping into people's creativity. It connects theory to practice in innovative ways. So this is a deeply theorized practice, which I think is something that sometimes surprises people who are new to action research. It works, as I just said, to achieve change on multiple levels and to share knowledge with new audiences. That oftentimes means finding different outlets for sharing our knowledge. So it's not just about academic presentations. And it's research that matters when we take responsibility for making a difference in the world. Oh, Shirley, now I can't advance my slides, so you're gonna have to put me back. Or wait a minute, can you just let me share my slides?
I'm making you again a co-host then.
Okay, well, we'll just deal with that. Thank you. Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that pause, folks. So what I want to do now, that's a just general overview of action research, what it's about, what we're trying to achieve, how to do it ethically. What I want to do now is talk about some selected action research methods. And I hope you all have a piece of paper and a pen because I want you to do some of these things. Okay, so here's just a very few, and we're going to touch on some of these today. And these are just examples of people engaged in action research in different ways. So first is fishbone diagrams. So if you have a piece of paper in front of you, what I want you to do is to draw a fish skeleton. We've done this sometimes at Errol. So some of you I know are very talented fish drawers. And then what you do once you get the fish skeleton on there is you make the head of the fish the issue or problem that you're interested in investigating. So, you know, what's going on? Is it a matter of wanting, I know that one of the first projects that I read at one of the early Aero conference was a study of working in Indigenous communities there in the Philippines around Indigenous languages. So maybe that's the issue that you're trying to investigate, how to get Indigenous languages more, you know, common in the classroom and that people feel more comfortable speaking their mother tongues. Label the bones of the fish with what you see contributing to the problem or issue. And then choose a particular contributing factor and make this the head of a new fish. What this does when you do the fishbone diagram, and normally what you do is do this with a group of people. You may be trying this out on your own now, but normally what you do is have the group that you're working with do the fishbone diagram together and contribute ideas to the bones. And then you can look at it together and say, okay, you know, the problem is maybe more complex than we thought. So it's not going to be just if I do this, we'll solve the problem, right? Because you begin to see how complex it really is. But it also gives you a way in. You can say, yes, it's a complex problem, but we could start by, you know, in the case of one of the Indigenous language projects, bringing music in people's first languages into the classroom. That might be a way to start, and then you sort of take it from there. So it's one of the things you'll see about a lot of action research methodologies is they're very inexpensive to do because a lot of times we're working in under-resourced communities. They're pretty fast, oftentimes. They're engaging and fun, but they also get us to a different kind of knowledge about what the problems are. World cafes. World cafes are really fun. As you see, that's sort of the top of the slide. It says, have fun, listen together, slow down, link and connect ideas. The way a World Cafe works is and this can work with a large group of people. You could run a World Cafe. You'll see that some of the, and we'll talk about this in a bit, some of the methods are really well developed for large groups, and some are good for small groups. Some are good for lots of different kinds of people. You know, just some at the beginning, some at the end of the process. World cafes can be done with a very large group of people. You could run a World Cafe with 150 people if you wanted to. And the idea is that you find a suitably sized setting. In fact, you don't want to do it with too few people because that would just be a boring cafe. You probably want at least 50 people, I would say. You set up tables, like cafe tables with, you know, 5 or 6 chairs around each table. You try to make them look nice with tablecloths. Maybe you cover it with paper so that people can write on the paper. That's often a good thing to do. And you know, have some food available so that people feel relaxed and like they're ready to chat with each other. And then you have a question. And so you have an initial question and everybody at the table discusses that question. You have someone who's going to take notes and stay at the table and kind of track the conversation. And then after a few minutes, you say, okay, now we're going to move to another table, and everybody gets up and moves around so that you have initiate a new conversation. So by the time you're done, you've maybe had 3 or 4 cycles of people having a conversation, getting up, moving to another table, extending the conversation. And you have people report out about what was the nature of the conversation, what happened, what did we learn together in this process. So sharing collective discoveries. It's a good way to sort of start an action research process, I think, to sort of begin to surface ideas and questions and concerns. And again, it's very unintimidating as a research process, and people get to know each other. So it goes back to that relationship. Photovoice. Photovoice is one of my favorite research methodologies in action research. And it involves giving people cameras and having them take pictures about that somehow capture what they see as being the problem or issue that you're dealing with. So for instance, if I wanted to do one on the project that I was talking about that Dr. Prudente and I were part of a training for about sort of picking up beach trash, you might ask people to go out and take pictures of what do the beaches here look like? You know, what's the problem? And then bring them back and share them or talk about them. And normally what we do is we'd have a process called the showed process, where we look together to see what that photograph is about. This is actually a picture, I don't know, Dr. Prudente, if you remember this, but this is one of the schools that we visited together. And this is a physics lesson in the classroom. And it was a brilliant lesson. It was about work. And these young women are demonstrating the physical property of work. as part of a team, and each team was charged with acting out the idea of work in their classroom. And you can see the other teams are clapping for them and are enjoying the lesson very much. So if I took this photograph, and normally what you do is you'd have a photograph that represented the problem that you're working on together. Here we're looking at a photograph that isn't one that we're involved in directly, but this showed process here allows you sort of a way of analyzing these images together. So you start by saying, what do you actually see happening? Just describe what's in that image. And then, well, what's really happening here? How do you interpret that? What does it mean? How does this relate to our lives? What do we learn from looking at this photograph about education, about opportunities for education, about how children learn effectively in classrooms? Why does this situation exist? What's the political nature of it? And then finally, and most important in an action research context, what can we do about it? What action might we take to address whatever that problem or concern is? One of the other things you can do with Photovoice is to then use this as a way of sharing knowledge. So having public displays of the images that people can go and look at, and you can talk about the concern. It brings people from the broader community into the conversation. And it's something, frankly, that anybody can do. One of my former students did her master's project working with 3-year-olds, teaching 3-year-olds how to do Photovoice, and wrote a book about it called Click, because that's the sound that the camera makes. So, there was a brilliant project with young people on the autism spectrum using Photovoice. So one of the key things about action research, I think, is the idea that every single human being has knowledge and experience that are important and that can be shared and that can help us to understand the world better. And our job as action researchers is to find ways to help people to share that knowledge and experience. And Photovoice, I think, is a really wonderful way of doing that. Indigenous forms of knowledge and based research. These are just some examples of different Indigenous action research projects. The one on the left-hand side is from the work by my friend Michael Kroll, who does work in the Inuit community on youth suicide prevention. Apparently the Inuit community has a very high rate of youth suicide, and they were looking at how to address that. And one of the things they found was that bringing young people back into connection with their own culture and their community through interacting with elders in their community was a really important way to do that. So that's an image from his project. The one in the center is an image from Roz Beadle's dissertation, which was a study of a women's breakfast making group at a school. And I love Aboriginal art like this because when you first look at it, it seems totally abstract. But if you look at the center, that's the women in their breakfast club, and then they start doing all these other projects. So there they are in all the branches of this image doing other food production processes. So when you know the story behind it, it suddenly becomes very clear what that image is all about. I just think that's brilliant. And Roz's dissertation opens with this image. The first thing you see when you start to read Roz's dissertation is that piece of artwork by one of the women in her breakfast group, and then the story of the breakfast group in the women's own language, again, really centering Indigenous languages. And then her dissertation begins, but really centering the knowledge and experience of her participants up in front, up in center in her dissertation. And finally, the other image is my friend Ylva Janaknuti, who's a Sami woman from northern Sweden and Norway, who does work on Indigenous mathematics education, which for those of you who might be math educators, I just think it's brilliant work and something you might really enjoy. Youth Participatory Action Research, or YPAR, is a really wonderful way. I mean, it's of these methods, but the idea is to get young people involved as researchers in their own right. And this is an example of a study, a freedom writers study at a high school near where I used to teach, getting young people involved in doing creative writing and sharing their writing with other people, with the community. Appreciative inquiry and asset mapping are two different approaches to action research that share the idea that we too often look at what's wrong in communities rather than what's right in communities. And if we would begin by thinking about what are the strengths and assets of this community and how can we draw upon those assets in order to create change, we have a different vision. You know, it's not always a deficit model, but it's really looking at communities as places, you know, even communities that are very economically challenged, marginalized, have incredible cultural assets, personal assets, historical assets that we can draw upon in making positive change. David Cooperrider is the person who sort of came up with the idea of appreciative inquiry. And this is what he talked about. He said it's a cooperative search for the best in people, their organizations, and the world around them. It involves systemic discovery of what gives a system life when it is most effective and capable in economic, ecological, and human terms. And I like that idea of, you know, our research should be about what gives a system life. And Kretzmann and McKnight are the people who kind of came up with asset-based community development. And here again, they talk about, you know, every single person has abilities and gifts, and living a good life depends on whether your gifts, your particular gifts, and the gifts of people around you can be used, expressed, and gifts given. If they are, the person will be valued, feel powerful, and well connected to the people around them. And the community around the person will be more powerful because of the contribution that person is making. I just think that's a really powerful way of thinking about how we can engage in research processes that truly honor the gifts of each person that we interact with. It's just a good way to approach life in general, don't you think? Okay, fishbowl exercises. This is, again, very inexpensive, very powerful way of getting people deeply into a conversation about an issue. So it starts by having, you can see, you sort of, again, you rearrange the furniture, set up a circle of chairs in the center of the room. Usually about 5 chairs is good. And then you invite people to come into the circle. You notice that there's always a chair empty. See, there's one chair there in the back that's empty. Oh, by the way, that person in the flowered jacket is Anna Inga Hilson, the person who does covenantal ethics from Norway. This is a workshop we did in Bristol in England. And so you then generate the conversation. You know, let's say you want to talk about, in our case right now, how do we go back to school in the middle of a pandemic and have teachers and students be safe and still have opportunities to learn? We're planning to go back and do it all remotely, but it's a question as to how that's going to work here. And maybe that's the question that you're going to be discussing. And some people come into the circle and begin to share their ideas, respond to one another. And the idea is they're talking to one another, but you can see people on the outside are listening to them. Their job isn't to sort of, you know, talk from the side. Their job is to just listen from the outside. But then at some point, maybe one of them wants to come into the circle and will take that empty chair, and another person will leave and go back into the outer circle. So you've got that outer circle of observers and the inner circle of people speaking in the fishbowl, but it's a permeable circle. People are moving in and out of that circle. And you would carry this on for, you know, as long as it feels like it's still productive, but, you know, at least 15 minutes, because people need some time to get going and to think about the issue. Maybe as long as a half hour to really get into the idea. And maybe be taking some notes as a facilitator, so we can sort of reflect back with people on what was heard. Group level assessment is a methodology that my friend Lisa Vaughn came up with, which is a way of getting a fairly large group. Again, this is kind of like World Café in a sense that it addresses large groups to look at an issue together. And what you do is you get a large room with, the other thing that we use a lot is Post-it notes. And anybody of you who've been in an action research workshop with me knows that Post-it notes are like a requirement. You get like large pieces of paper on the wall, and you put up a question or a prompt that should be kind of open-ended and kind of generative, you know, something that's going to make people think in more creative, out-of-the-box kinds of ways. So let's say we were, again, thinking about the pandemic and teaching. Maybe one of them is, I'm most frightened of, and then people go and say something. But one of them would also be, you know, things that I've learned during the pandemic. So it would be a more positive thing. And you give everybody a pen, a marker, and they go around and they just respond to each of the prompts. And there might be 25, 30 prompts up on the walls. People go around. And then you have a second round where people are supposed to go around and sort of put check marks, you know, what really struck them, what do they agree with, respond to one another. And then you take the posts down and you work in small groups to analyze what's on the posts together. So, you'd have like groups of about 4 people with 5 or 6 prompts thinking together about, well, are there common themes here that we can be looking at? And again, the study that I mentioned earlier about domestic violence, they did a group level assessment in the city of Cincinnati with people from the mayor's office, judges, but also people who were serving victims of domestic violence, who had been maybe survivors of domestic violence. So they had a very large mixed group, and out of that came really clear ideas for how they were going to address the problem of domestic violence within the legal system. So this is just those phases. You sort of start by climate setting, generating the ideas by going around to the prompts, appreciating, reflecting on it, understanding, selecting, and then coming up with some action. Theater of the oppressed. Again, I mentioned earlier that we have a lot of arts-based methods. Theater of the oppressed comes out of the work of a person named Augusto Boal, who was a Brazilian action researcher and sort of innovative theater person. And the idea is to get people involved in creating short, sort of impromptu theatrical pieces that deal with some problem or issue and then acting them out. And in doing that, you kind of get a sense of how people understand that. And then you can have people, like the actors can do it, and then other people in the audience, it's kind of like a fishbowl, can come in and suggest a different resolution. I mean, you can read about Theater of the Oppressed. It's a very powerful process, but one that you probably want to start with somebody who's trained in it, rather than just trying it on your own. Sort of try to find somebody who's a trainer in Theater of the Oppressed. This woman, Frances, is somebody that I've worked with a couple of times who actually is a trainer in Theater of the Oppressed in England, and just gives you a very good idea of how to go about doing this kind of work. Future creating workshops. This comes out of the work of people at Roskilde University. If you look at the lower left-hand corner, the woman with blonde hair there, that's Ditte Tufting, who is one of the researchers from Roskilde who came up with this process. And the idea of a future creating workshop, it comes out of an approach to action research called critical utopian action research. And in critical utopian action research, the idea is to try to create a utopian vision of the future and then think about how could we make that future a reality. So it really asks you to think sort of creatively about how to create change. And it starts with a critique phase where you sort of try to identify, okay, what's wrong with this situation? If we were going to do it about, in fact, I'm going to be doing one with people in Bristol that in Gloucestershire that I work with about how would you imagine the post-COVID world? Like, what kind of change we want to see. So the first thing you say is, so what's wrong with the world as it is? What's the critique phase? And then the second phase is a utopian phase. If we could have anything we wanted, no holds barred, no resource problems, just anything we wanted to see happen could happen, what would we want the world to look like? And you have people generate that, again, by putting big pieces of paper up on the wall. You can see all of the things in these pictures are just ideas that people have generated. So you'll have an audience of people sitting around the facilitators, just shouting out short phrases. What I'd like to see, like, let's say we're talking about the teaching in the pandemic. I'd like to see every child have a laptop computer. Okay, then laptop computers goes up on the list. I'd like to see children having outdoor places to play where they can play safely and be with each other, but outdoors where it might be safer. So outdoor spaces to play, or whatever it is. And then when you get to realization phase, this is what these folks are doing, sitting on the floor. You're trying to look at all of that and think, okay, what kind of concrete steps could we take to make this a reality? I'm actually going to be doing one. This is what we're going to be doing in Gloucestershire online. One of the things you may be thinking about during the pandemic is how in heaven's name do you go about doing community-based research when we're all locked in our houses? And so we came up with this idea of doing an online future creating workshop. I think you could do other things too. I mean, you could obviously, do something like a fishbone diagram. You could do the fishbowl exercise, I think, in a Zoom setting. I think that there are ways of adapting some of these to an online environment for the, time being. They're all having to do that. But this one in particular is one that my friend Miriam Rader-Roth came up with because she works with teachers from across the country, and she was trying to get all the teachers together, but in an asynchronous way. Like we could do this with everybody in the Philippines, right? Because it doesn't have to be, I don't have to get up at 5:30 if everybody can participate in their own time to participate in this future creating workshop. So the idea is that we're using an app called Padlet to do this. So you have the critique phase on Padlet, and people can post sort of virtual Post-it notes to this website, on this Padlet board. And so just as, so we have them, there's you can see that little pink circle with the plus in it. You click on that and it will open up a little Post-it note that you could write on to put your idea. And all the directions are here about how to go about doing it. So just as you do a future creating workshop, if you were doing it in person, we're going to be doing it asynchronously online. And so people will post their Post-it notes. They'll respond to one another by voting. They'll each take a turn at creating, sort of moving the Post-it notes around to create different themes. And as researchers, we'll be capturing all of that. And then we'll move into a utopian phase and finally into a realization phase, but all in an asynchronous online environment. So if you all are sort of thinking about, I'd like to be able to do some research, but how can I do it under the current circumstances? This might be something to look into, and I'd be happy to share sort of the instructions with you if you wanted to give it a try. Systemic action research. This was developed by a person named Danny Burns, who's at the Institute for Development Studies in England. And I think it's an important way to think about action research, because what he says is that no one project is going to create large systemic change. What's going to create large systemic change, like if we really want to change the educational system in a way that makes education accessible to all children, one project isn't going to do it. But if we're all doing that, and it's one of the beauties of Arrow, I think, right? Every year we bring together 250 to 300 educators from the Philippines who are thinking about educational change. And every one of our projects is important, but what's most important is that all of those projects together have the power to create real change in educational systems. And so, thinking about how do you link projects together so that we could kind of combine the power of each of those projects in some way is what systemic action research talks about. This is what Danny says about that. He says, if action research is to be an effective political tool, then it has to move beyond the single local group, team, or organization to work across organizations, networks, and partnerships on multiple sites and at multiple levels. Danny's own work has focused in large part on bonded labor and modern day forms of slavery. So he works in many communities at the same time, looking at why do we have problems of bonded labor where people get into such dire financial difficulties that some member of their family has to basically go to work for no money for a period of time to serve someone to pay off a debt. Why is this happening and how can we address it? But he's been doing that across, like large parts of India and Bangladesh where this is a particular problem. So using his own sort of approach to systemic action research. So this, by the way, is my research team in Gloucestershire from last year at our research site. So that's just some of the methods. Shirley, do we want to stop for some questions in chat, or should I just go ahead and talk about finding the right method here?
Just go ahead and discuss, and towards the end of your lecture, we'll have a Q&A. I encourage the participants to type in your questions if you have any, and then I can just pick out the questions later on for the Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so how do you go about finding the right questions to ask yourself? Finding the right method, things to ask yourself about finding the right method. So first question might be, who are your participants? If you're working with young people, for example, youth participatory action research is a great method. If you're talking with young people, digital storytelling, which is like Photovoice, but involves creating videos together. Young people are very adept at using technology and like being able to like create videos and images. They do that on their own time, and it's a great way of getting them involved. There's a group in South Africa called the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation that does some really wonderful work using digital storytelling with young people in some of the townships in South Africa. If you're working with older people who may not feel as comfortable with the technology, oral history can be a really powerful way of learning about the history of that community from the people who've lived that history. Right now in the United States, we're dealing with a lot of protests regarding racism and police violence against African-American people in this country. Learning from our elders, older African-Americans in our community who have seen racism over the years and understand sort of what the long arc of history, as Martin Luther King would say, is all about, can share their knowledge and experiences with us. And you can use photo elicitation, which is kind of like Photovoice, but in photo elicitation, what you try to do is to take existing photographs and have people respond to them. And you've probably all done that with older members of your family, sort of taken a look at an old photo album with people and talked about, someone's wedding or birthday or a celebration. Well, imagine doing that with sort of images of what this community looked like when they were younger, and how has the community changed for the better, how has the community changed for the worse, what kind of changes would we like to see, things like that. Persons with learning disabilities. Theater of the Oppressed is a great way to get people involved. There are a couple of different groups that I know of in the United Kingdom, one of which I've worked with more closely, a group called the Misfits, that is a theater group for individuals with learning disabilities. And they just do wonderful Theater of the Oppressed projects. And what they do is they create theater pieces about what it's like to be a person with a learning disability interacting with service providers. And then they do training for people who are students in social work and in healthcare and health provision about how people with learning disabilities would like to be treated, with respect, with their feelings taken into account, with some sense that they have decision-making ability. And they do trainings using Theater of the Oppressed that are just extraordinarily powerful. So it's a really, really wonderful method. Second language learners. A lot of research methods depend on people being able to speak and to do that, confidently and coherently. And if you're trying to speak in a second language, that's not always the case. Photovoice allows you to capture those ideas in an image and then share them with someone else. I've also used Photovoice. I used to work with refugee families here in a family literacy program, and we could use the photographs that people took to develop literacy materials that they could then use to promote their language learning in a more authentic way. So it can be both a learning tool as well as a research tool. Busy people, who isn't busy? Group level assessment goes really fast. You can do that in a couple of hours and get a lot of really great data generated and people connecting. Same thing with World Café. Some of these methods really just don't take that long. So what kind of issue are you trying to explore? Are you trying to make sense of the past? Are you trying to bring together diverse groups of stakeholders? Group level assessment is good for that. We've talked about sometimes groups are divided groups. There's something called action science that's sort of developed to do that. Trying to clarify organizational goals and values. Structured ethical reflection, which is something that I developed, is a good way of having people talk about their values and ethical principles together. Identifying organizational assets. Again, this gets back to appreciative inquiry and asset-based community development. Articulating key organizational issues and challenges. Research circles, which is another method that was developed by some of our Scandinavian action research colleagues, is a longer term process where you get a group together, oftentimes over many months, on a regular basis, say meeting every couple of weeks or every month to really investigate an issue. One of the projects they did was with healthcare workers and particularly cleaners in hospitals who know a lot more about what goes on in a hospital than anybody else, than any doctor in the hospital, to talk about how to improve healthcare outcomes by instituting better hygiene in hospitals. And they're the ones who really know it. So they met over many, many months and came up with ideas that they could bring to the administration of the hospital around how to do that. Creating innovative strategies for organizational change, future creating workshops are a good way to do that. Developing strategies for assessing the impact of change and guiding new initiatives. Action evaluation is a good way to do that. So you want to think about, okay, what are we trying to accomplish and which method is best suited to that particular goal? So, we talked about levels of change. What kind of levels of change do you want to see happen? In individual change, first person action research, which is really a matter of personal individual reflection on a problem or an issue. Reflective practice are good ways of doing that. Classroom or group change, classroom-based action research. Appreciative inquiry might be a good way to look at organizational change. All the way up to, action evaluation is a good way to look at legal systems and international change. That systemic action research that really looks broadly at, bringing different projects together would be a good way to do that. And where are you in the process? Are you just getting started? If you're just getting started, as we talked about earlier, fishbone diagrams are a great way to just sort of kick it off, Doesn't take much, get a few people together, take a look at these fishbone diagrams. It gives you some sort of ideas of how to get started on a project. Asset mapping is another way to do that, to really look at what are the assets, what are the strengths, what have we already got in this community? What kind of knowledge do people have? What kind of relationships do people have? What kind of materials do people have? What kind of skills do people have? And there's tools that you can use to really, it's like an inventory of what does everybody who's involved in this project bring to the table. And it might be things that you wouldn't think about. Like maybe somebody is a really great musician and you hadn't known that, but maybe, you can have a music night and bring people together around music. So that person's going to be really important with a skill that maybe you didn't even realize that person had. Or maybe somebody's a great cook and can bring treats to a project. So, you want to really have a sense of everybody can bring something and do something and contribute something. What is that? And asset mapping helps you figure that out. Creating a research question. Concept mapping is a good way to do that, where you really think about, let's try to create a visual image of what this problem is that we can create a research question about. And even if you're just trying to create a research question on your own for your project, concept mapping can be a helpful way to do that. Trying to make sense of what's going on. Any one of these processes that we've talked about is a good way to do that. Developing an action plan, something like critical utopian action research is a good way to do that, because there's a realization phase where you really think about, what's the impact here and what are we going to do? And then evaluating the impact of your intervention. Something like action evaluation is a good way to do that. And there are lots of participatory evaluation processes. Yolande Wadsworth, who's an Australian action researcher, has written whole books about action evaluation that might be useful. Okay, so what if you have, what kind of time and resources do you have? You've got no time and no resources. What are you going to do? You could just sort of say, well, I can't do anything because I don't have any time and I don't have any resources, but you should never give up that easily. Think about fishbone diagrams. As I said, they go really fast. You don't need anything but a piece of paper and a pen. That's really easy. You have time, but no resources. Research circles are a good way to do that, because again, you do that over many months, but it's not very resource intensive. You've got resources, but not a lot of time. Theater of the Oppressed might be a good way to go, because you do want to have a trained facilitator doing that, and it does take some resources, but not a lot. Time and resources, future creating workshops, digital storytelling, because it takes more technology to do, would be useful ways of going about doing it. Okay, so let's move to thinking about quality criteria for action research. This set of, and this is related to sort of how do you evaluate whether you're doing a good project, but these are also the quality criteria that we use when we determine whether or not to publish a piece of action research. So these came out of the Action Research Journal's directions to authors. And then we've kind of expanded on them to just give them a little bit more detail. So here are the things that we look for. And I worked with the Action Research Journal for many years. I now work with the Educational Action Research Journal. We have a similar set of criteria for deciding on what to publish, right? So one is, does the author have a clear articulation of the objectives of their study. So the extent to which the authors explicitly address the objectives they believe are relevant to their work and the choices they have made in meeting those. So it's very important when you're writing your action research up for publication to be clear about what it is you are trying to achieve. Second, partnership and participation, the extent to and means by which the paper reflects or enacts participative values and concern for the relational component of the research. Extent of participation referring to a continuum from consultation with stakeholders to stakeholders as full co-researchers. We're not anticipating that in every action research project, stakeholders are going to be full researchers. That's not always possible. We want to try to engage people to the extent that it's possible in a project, but as it says here, that's a continuum. But we need to know what that continuum is, where you are on the continuum, and how you made the decision, and what efforts you made to try to get people engaged in the process. Contribution to action theory and practice. The extent to which the paper builds on and creates explicit links with or contributes to a wider body of practice, knowledge, and or theory that contribute to the action research literature. Okay? So it might be a really good project as an action learning project, and you may have improved your own practice, but if it's not contributing something new to the literature, if we already knew that, then it's not going to be helpful, and we're not likely to be able to publish it. So sort of answering the so what question. Methods and processes, the extent to which the particular methods that you chose are well articulated and clear. Most action research journals are, because we're methodology journals, we're most interested in how you did it. We want to know what happened, but the most interesting questions to us are really understanding how have you developed action research processes in a novel way to conduct your study. So you sort of really want the focus in these journals to be on that. Other journals like that are about, say, educational outcomes or career development, you'd want to look at the outcomes more and just say a little bit about the methods. But here, these are methodology journals that we really want to look at that. Actionability, the extent to which the paper provides new ideas that guide action in response to need. So, again, the key to action research is we want to be able to do something, right? Take some action, make some change. So we want to see evidence that that's happened in the project. Reflexivity, with the stuff that Alfredo and I have been doing lately, we've talked a lot about how key the idea of reflection is in the action research process. In an ongoing way, we need to be questioning ourselves as researchers about what we're doing, how's it going, what are our relationships like? How could we improve our practice? So the extent to which the self is located as a change agent and is discussed in the piece. And finally, significance. And this gets back to that idea of the contribution that it makes. The extent to which the insights in the manuscript are significant in content and process. By significant, we mean having meaning and relevance beyond their immediate context in support of the flourishing of persons, communities, and the wider ecology. So it could be a really great project and have a really important impact in your own classroom or your own school or your own community. But if it's not contributing something new and significant that others can learn from, then it's not going to be published, because we want to have things that other people are going to be learned from and be able to build upon. Okay, so I'm going to finish up here. I think we'll probably have about a half hour for questions, I hope, with just some examples of projects that are going on. This is the Global Environmental Literacy, the Climate Change Education Project that was mentioned earlier. And if you look at this picture, on the left-hand side, the young man standing there with the kids around him, that's my teacher partner, Ben Kolb. On the bottom are my partners in South Africa. The picture in the middle there is kids at my school planting trees. And the one on the far right is from Zobel, the La South Zobel. This is, they do a lot of work there in robotics. And this is, I think this is the Elobot, which is an amazing robot that was invented by the kids there at Zobel. That's like an urban agricultural site. That's like a Ferris wheel, but with farming, which is just brilliant. So this is one project. And this is sort of one of those projects that is an international project. The idea is to link kids in different parts of the world who are studying climate change in their own communities and sharing their knowledge with peers in other parts of the world so that they understand that climate change is happening everywhere. It looks different in different parts of the world. Some people are just trying to respond to the problems created by other people, and that if we work together, we can do something about it. So it's a very exciting project to me. This is the Gloucestershire project that I mentioned earlier. This is that picture in the upper right-hand corner is actually a motorway services, a gas station. I mean, I've been in gas stations in the Philippines and here in the United States, and they don't look anything like that. And the idea is to take profits from the motorway services back into some of the most economically deprived communities in England to create community change. And what we're doing here in the bottom right-hand corner and the upper left-hand corner, those are future creating workshops that we conducted in the communities, getting people together to talk about the future of their community and what they want that to look like. This is a project that the person in the lower left-hand corner is my student, Adam Stieglitz. This is a project that he's doing in Peru, working with indigenous farming communities to think about how to improve, how to adapt farming practices in the face of climate change. And so he actually went to collect data in March and hasn't been able to leave since. So he ended up with a rather extended data collection opportunity when the COVID-19 virus hit and he couldn't get out of the country. So you never know. You want to remember what I said about expect the unexpected? I think he's learning that right now. This is, again, arts-based action research. The young woman sitting there is Sarah Hellmann, who is an art educator. And her dissertation was a study with at-risk young women and sort of understanding their perspective on the challenges that they faced. And this is actually her dissertation defense in an art gallery with her art and the girls' art, and having people at the dissertation defense create art together. And we decided after Sarah's dissertation defense that we weren't going to call them a defense anymore, that we're going to start calling them a dissertation celebration, because it was really this very rich celebration of her work and the work of the participants in her study. This is a project, this is Alice Willatt, who is a colleague of mine from Bristol, who did work in a community kitchen. This was her action research project, looking at how people could come together. She does a lot of work on food waste and food systems, foodscapes, they're now calling them, and how food can bring us together. Access to healthy food is an important thing for everyone. It gets to things like climate change and environmental issues because of things like food waste. So it's a really huge issue, and one that I think is a very rich one. This is Bruce Damons, who is an action researcher from South Africa, who did a really wonderful study about bringing parents and community volunteers into a community school to support the school. He's now at Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University in South Africa. And this is, remember, I mentioned earlier, the Misfits, the theater group that I work with in Southern England. This is an image from their website. They're the ones who do theater of the oppressed. And this is a project, the gentleman standing there in the image is Victor Friedman, who's a very well-known action researcher. And he does a lot of work, he has for years, trying to bring together Arab and Jewish Israelis to try to sort of, bridge the divide between those communities. This is a project that he did in the nursing school at his university, where he had both Arab and Jewish Israeli students, but they very rarely interacted with one another. And trying to bring those students together so that they can develop closer relationships and more trust is something Victor has really dedicated his life to doing in that part of the world. So that's the end. The last part, this is me offering you a piece of action research candy. You really have to try these things. So we'll leave it at that. And Shirley, you can stop sharing.
Okay. Thank you.
And I'm happy to take questions.
Shirley. Thank you so much. That was really fantastic. It's like Arnold 2020 online. Okay. Okay.
Steroids.
Hi, Dr. Bing. Okay, what can you say? We are so lucky. The Filipino crowd is actually very lucky to have you, Mary. We have some questions here. I'm looking at the chat box. Okay, let me just read them so that we can facilitate the Q&A. I know that you have to leave before 7 o'clock. Okay,
Yep.
and we'd like to have, you know, the usual picture taking before you leave. So, okay, we'll make this real quick. So I'm reading the question of David Dakanay. Hi, Dr. Miller. What's your preference in doing action research? Is it quali or quanti?
Oh, I'm much more of a qualitative person, to be honest. And I'm really more of an action research person. But that said, you know, I think oftentimes people think that there's quantitative research and qualitative research, and action research is a form of qualitative research. But I think that's incorrect. I would say that there's action research. That's the overarching one. Everybody should be doing action research. But even if you don't quite buy that, there's quantitative research, qualitative research, and action research is a distinct form of research from the other two. And it's distinct because it has a different epistemology and ontology. We understand the nature of knowledge and how knowledge is generated in a distinctly different way than traditional quantitative or qualitative researchers, because knowledge is generated through action. That's the whole point of action research. That said, we're perfectly willing to use the methods of either quantitative or qualitative research. So, you know, if it makes sense to collect quantitative data about something, I'm more than happy to do that. The Gloucestershire project that we're working on, we survey people visiting that motorway services to find out if they know about what we're doing in the community. And we've been, you know, collecting thousands of responses from people and running, you know, statistical analyses of it. It's part of our action research project just as much as the future creating workshops that we're doing in the community. So I'd say it's not a matter, I mean, for me, I enjoy arts-based methods. I like the theater of the oppressed. I like, you know, all of this, but I'm also enjoying now sort of learning about doing online research in a future creating workshop. I just like learning new ways of doing things and exploring them. So it's always something different for me.
Thank you, Mary. Okay, we have one more question here. I'm reading from, okay, I forgot the name. Dr. Miller, thank you for your, okay. It says here, I would like to ask if Photovoice can be complemented by other qualitative research methods. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, for the most part, I wouldn't base any action research process generally on any one of these. I mean, you might, but I think it's most powerful when you sort of think about different methods that might complement one another. So, you know, you could do some interviews maybe initially with people to just develop sort of a sense of relationships in the community. And you could follow that with a Photovoice project where you sort of looked at something, but then maybe you follow that by doing a future creating workshop. So think about, you know, not just one method necessarily, but drawing on different methods. You can definitely combine that with other things.
Okay, thank you. There's one more from Jocelyn Kamalig. During this time of pandemic and less contact is required, can we use online means in gathering data for an action research?
Absolutely. And, you know, I encourage people to really think about, you know, things like, you know, you could have a Zoom chat like this, right? You could set this up with people just like we're doing now. And we could set it up to have a fishbowl, right? We could just unmute some people and you all could talk, and then you could mute yourself again and somebody else could unmute themselves and have a conversation. So I think it's going to take some creativity on our part. And the downside is that we have to be especially mindful of the fact that access to technology marginalizes, you know, a lack of access to technology further marginalizes people who are already marginalized in our societies. Like if I'm thinking about the kids that we're now trying to reach by doing remote learning in my school district, you know, there are kids, we've brought something like 30,000 Chromebooks into the hands of children. And that's great, right? Those are 30,000 children who didn't have access to technology before, but what about internet access? What about if there are 3 or 4 children in that family and they only have one Chromebook and they're supposed to be on technology all the time? What if they're a child who needs extra support because they have learning difficulties of some kind and just access to a Chromebook isn't going to provide educational opportunities to them? We need to be on our game and really trying to be creative at this time in figuring out how we're going to improve educational outcomes for kids, conduct research that's meaningful. I think it can be done, but it's going to take people being really creative, I think, to do that.
Dr. Bing Prudente, you can always butt in if you wish. You can always add more to the answers of Dr. Mary. Okay, we are inviting you in. We have another question from Dr. Laxman Bandari from Nepal. Okay, so he's asking, are there any specific quality standards in order to establish the rigor in action research?
Yeah, I mean, we are responsible for all of the, it's kind of like everything they do plus more. So that, if you're doing quantitative research, the same, validity and reliability issues that anybody faces are the same that we face. You're thinking about a more qualitative method, issues around credibility and transferability of knowledge are important. But, to some extent, action research is also, it's about action, right? So, what happened as a result, and to talk about, it doesn't mean it always works. One of the things I like about action research is that we talk about our failures. My friend Victor Friedman, who I mentioned earlier, has written a brilliant piece about an epic failure. And I learned more from that than, most sort of like shining kind of examples of, oh, it all worked all so well and we all got along so great. Victor just kind of cut to the chase and said, I really messed up here. And, here's why, and here's how not to do that. So, I think, one of the aspects of rigor is honesty, being honest about what happens in the research process. And, I think in a lot of quantitative research, when we only publish significant results, right, it's problematic because, with error rates, right, this could be the one time out of 100 that this thing actually worked, and we're going to publish not the other 99 where it failed miserably. So, we need to be really honest about our research processes. That gets back to those quality criteria that I talked about earlier, and what we publish, being really clear about what the process was about, where it worked, where it did not work, are all things that I think we're responsible for, just honest with one another about in sharing our knowledge and our experience.
Thank you.
Bing, do you have anything you'd add to that?
Dr. Bing, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think we can learn from what Professor Mary mentioned in terms of the timeliness of action research. Now that the Philippines is among all countries in the world are experiencing the same, our students and our teachers are not ready for online learning and teaching. And so as teachers, we can look into the affordances and constraints that are being experienced by teachers and learners so that we can learn from this. The current situation will help us look at more effective and more efficient practices. The current basic education system, particularly in the public school, is now facing challenges in terms of whether these modules, online modules, and printed modules will work. So hearing the different methods described by Professor Mary will lead, I hope, will lead us to think about what action researches can we do, since we're going to, implement firsthand, for the first time, online teaching and learning, and other means of reaching out to our students, especially in the public schools who are marginalized in terms of digital devices.
One of the questions that I saw come up was around outputs. And I'm thinking as you're talking, Bing, that we need to create, this is a challenge to all of us who are online now, we need to create a space where teachers can do very quick action research projects about what they're doing to respond to the pandemic and share it with one another so that we very quickly are able to learn from one another about what's working and what isn't working. Because waiting for publication isn't gonna do it right now, right? We need answers immediately to what's working and not working in remote learning. I mean, it's the same thing in my district here. So I wonder if we could create a space where teachers could, be mentored in doing very fast action research projects about, this kind of lesson seems to be working online, or I tried this, but it didn't work, and here's why, successes and failures, but let's find a space where we can share that knowledge.
Shirley, perhaps leader can address this. Leader can set up that space for
Sure. Okay.
action researchers who might be willing to share their findings. We can do it on a monthly basis. And if it,
Okay.
yeah,
So yeah. Actually, we're going to have a meeting on that one because I was thinking of continuing this series of webinars, but I'd like to focus on just action research. Okay, because that's
yeah.
what leader is all about. So I mean, we've hosted a lot of linguistics related talks in the past, only because my bias is because I'm into linguistics. But in the next months to come, we'll probably be focusing on just action research, and this is to cater to our basic ed teachers. Okay, I'd like to read more questions here. Okay, if we still have time, right? We have about 90 more minutes. Okay, there's one here from Elizabeth Soriano. In the context of the Philippines, I don't know if this is what Dr. Bing just mentioned. Public school teachers are encouraged to do classroom-based action research, focusing on enhancing teaching learning process. So what is the best method, okay, to initially identify learning needs, okay, to continue what Dr. Bing was just talking about? Right, you can answer too, Dr. Bing or Dr. Mary. Probably like, okay, since now is online, what practical advice can you give our participants on how to do action research while we are on virtual class setup, something like that?
I think, I mentioned sort of the importance of reflection. I think starting out by keeping sort of a daily journal, and I realize that takes time, but it doesn't take a lot of time necessarily. 5 minutes at the end of each day to just jot down, here are some things that worked well. Here are some kids who seem to be struggling. Here's why I think they're struggling, and just sort of take some time for reflection. And then use that to initiate some kind of change. Like the next day, if one of the kids seems to be really struggling with something, think about, okay, let me try this, and it's going to have to all be really fast turnaround right now. But I think and it's so hard to take time for reflection because I know everybody's just like so busy and you're spending like every hour of every day. But I think our time would be better invested and more productive if we would stop and take some time for reflection. And that in itself can be an action research tool. A reflective journal can be a first-person action research tool.
Okay, great. I have one question here. There's one question here from Flori May Constantino, which is very witty. So candy store sounds appealing and tempting. Are there ideas on action research that should be sweetened? Thank you. So if there's any idea on action research that you want to probably sugarcoat, what would that be?
Oh,
because of the year time.
It's hard work. It's hard work. It sometimes doesn't work. You remember that song in Mary Poppins about, a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down? Remember that song? So maybe that's what this question is about. So I'd say, recognizing that it is hard work. It takes a lot of time building relationships, but that's, to me, also the fun of it, right? Is being in relationship with people and getting to know people. But I'd say sort of, and the idea that you have to know everything that traditional researchers know and a whole lot more. That roles and realms part is about developing a whole different set of skill sets than what we generally are taught in school, in graduate school. And so really thinking about how to build that toolkit and develop all of those skills that you need to do this work effectively is very challenging. But like I say, the candy store part of it is it's also really fun.
Thank you, Dr. B. We have 15 more minutes. Okay, I don't know if you have already mentioned this one. I think you did, but just to clarify, from Luis Quejada, is there a prescribed time frame for full-blown action research?
A prescribed time frame?
Yep.
No.
No.
Although I'll say, one of the things that I think can be daunting and intimidating about action research is it does seem like you sort of have signed a life contract on a project, which does not have to be the case. And I always tell students that, think about a scope of work that can be accomplished in the amount of time you have to do your, like if you're a student, your thesis or your dissertation. Maybe it's just one iteration one round of action research where you're, examining, reflecting on a problem, developing an action, taking an action, and observing what happens. That's enough to write a dissertation or a thesis. You don't have to be doing those multiple rounds and spending years. You can do it pretty quickly. The Danes, when they do future creating workshops, they spend days running a future creating workshop. They'll spend one whole day on the first phase, and then another whole day on a utopian phase. And then they take weeks off to develop the realizations, and then they come back. And I'm sure they're horrified at this, but I'll do it in an afternoon because that's how much time I have, with people who are busy. The future creating workshops that we're going to do online are asynchronous, but we're doing them over 3 weeks, but people can come in and out anytime they want. So that, it's only going to take like an hour and a half or so of each person's time for each phase of it. Bing's actually going to be participating in this with me, with the other people from Bing and Dr. Aguja and the people from Zobel. So, it can take, if you look at that sort of like, how to pick your method, pick a method that aligns with the amount of time and resources that you have. So if you don't have a lot of time and resources, use one of those methods that can go pretty quickly. Like if you're doing something like a World Café, you can do that in an afternoon and get a ton of data, as opposed to research circles that might take a much longer time. So match your methodology to the time and resources that you have available, I'd say.
Okay, probably one or two more questions from LV Lakdad. Dr. Miller, can you suggest a very good and doable action research for ELT in multicultural classroom setting? ELT is English language teaching.
Yeah. Well, like I say, I think Photovoice is a really powerful way of working with English language learners because, everyone is able to take a photograph. You may not be able to express yourself yet in the language in your classroom, whether that's, Filipino or English or whatever, but you can take a picture that captures some aspect of your life. And then what I did when I was working with refugees is I had them take pictures about what, some aspect of their lives here in the United States. And then if they were far enough along in their language, so they could write about it in English. If they weren't, they could write about it in their own language, and then we translate it into English. And then we used those English translations as their literacy materials, as their learning materials. So it was very relevant to their own lives because it was their own words that they were learning from. For those of you who may not be familiar with the work of Dr. Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian educational philosopher and practitioner and sort of the founder of like a major sort of approach to action research. This is a very Freirean way of doing education, is to really ground the learning and the experience of the students themselves. And I think Photovoice offers us a really powerful way to do that. And then to share with the rest of the community, those images, we can learn from those images about the lives of others that we may not be familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we have just 10 more minutes and there'll be like more picture taking and everything. But there's one from Franco Tonog here, and I just want to read it. Okay, this is also for Dr. Bing. Looking forward to more action research webinars. I hope there would be an in-depth discussion on each method in the Philippine context, focusing on its usability and contextuality under this ongoing pandemic. Okay. Dr. Bing and I and the Dean will be talking about that, how we can, host more webinars focusing on possibly a particular method for a particular situation, or, methods that fit into the Philippine context, something like that. Okay, yeah. We'll talk about that one, okay? I hope you can read the messages, Mary, okay? I mean, the whole Philippine crowd is so thankful for granting our request for you to give a workshop on this topic. Thank you very much. I know we cannot hold you beyond 7 o'clock, so at this point, okay, okay, I'm looking at the chat box, so I think that's all that, okay, can you please recommend a journal that publish action research? We have a lot, you can actually Google that one, okay, Dr. Marys, you can answer that one. Yeah.
Journals? Well, I'm biased because I'm on the editorial board of the Educational Action Research.
Yeah.
One of the things we might think about coming out of this is we're doing special issues, and I would love to do a special issue on action research in the Philippines. So that might be one thing we could do, is to sort of work together to do that sort of through ARRL. But we also just accepted submissions to the Educational Action Research Journal. There's a journal that's comes out of South Africa that my friend Leslie Wood is the editor of. That's a practitioner action research journal. So if you like, we can kind of, like when we start creating this space for sort of sharing experiences, maybe we can start creating a list of possible venues for people to think about publishing. Oh, thank you.
Okay, before I will award this one, Dr. Bing and I will award this one. What I would like to announce as early as now, Dr. Bing, if you give me the floor. Dr. Bing and I and the whole College of Education, Brother Andrew Gonzalez, College of Education, Bagsed, and the leader, okay, is coming up with oral journal, as you have heard last conference from Mary. Okay, we have already done the initial meeting on this one, but because of the of the situation, we were not able to continue with the plans. Like we wanted to have intensive workshop on the best paper awardees for the previous oral congresses. We wanted to gather them together, work on their manuscripts for the maiden issue of the oral journal. But because of the pandemic, we were not able to push through with that. But we are planning to work on that. We still are planning to launch the oral journal before the end of the year, if we can do that. So watch out for the call for papers soon, and watch out for the launching of the oral journal. It's going to be housed in De La Salle University LIDER, okay? And Dr. Bing is our editor-in-chief, okay? And of course, Mary, you are in our board of editorial advisors. So we are announcing already as early as now. So these are our plans. Dr. Bing, you want to say more about the plan?
Yeah, I think we also need to mention that we have planned to have membership for ARAL, because the participants for the past 5 years have been clamoring for it. So we will issue also, we will start having ARAL as a full-blown organization under LIDER. And so we are making arrangements so that it be recognized under SEC and all those things. So we're going to have ARAL membership, ARAL journal, and of course, all of these will be in our usual ARAL website.
Okay, so watch out for that. So we have the ARAL as the umbrella term. Then we have ARAL Society, that's the RLS. Then we have RLC, that's the ARAL Congress, which we have been conducting annually. And then watch out for the RLJ, which is ARAL Journal. All of these three big things will be under LIDER. So watch out for the announcement or launching of the ARAL Society and the ARAL Journal, because ARAL Congress is now doing fine. Okay, we have 6 minutes. So at this point, I'd like to again ask Dr. Bing to read the citation for the Certificate of Appreciation for Dr. Mary Brydon Miller. Dr. Bing, please do the honors.
Okay, so De La Salle University, Brother Andrew Gonzalez, FSC, College of Education, and the Lasallian Institute for Development and Educational Research present this Certificate of Appreciation to Dr. Mary Brydon Miller for conducting a lecture seminar on the Action Research Methodology Candy Store, Innovative Approaches to Data Gathering, held on July 22nd, 2020, 5:30 to 7 p.m. via Zoom, signed Dr. Raymond C. Season, Dean of Bagsed, and Dr. Shirley N. Dita, Director of LIDER.
Okay. Thank you very much. Our certificate of appreciation. I'll send you the PDF copy of this one, Dr. Mary. So I'd like to thank you again.
Bye, Mary.
Stand by.
Yes,
because I have a copy of the certificate.
Here's to next
So much,
time.
Mary. Thank you. Thank you. I'll be posting the pictures after this one. Okay. Thank you again.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Like,
Bye, everyone. Thank you all so much.
yeah, in the morning in Louisville. Okay, so thank you
That's
for
right.
wake up.
Sun's
already
almost
at
up.
5 o'clock. Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Regards to Bronwyn.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Bing. So at this point, okay, I'm going to, okay, wait, I'm going to send you now the link to the certificate. Okay, so some people are already telling in the chat box, got my e-certificate. That's great. Okay, watch out for more webinars on action research as we have announced earlier.